Welcome to State of Reform's virtual series, 5 Slides We're Discussing, with some of healthcare's most thoughtful leaders. And now, the host of State of Reform, DJ Wilson.
All right. Well, welcome to this conversation here at State of Reform. This is part of our 5 Slides We're Discussing series, where we try to use this multimedia time in which we find ourselves during COVID to bring in a few different graphics and images and use those to drive a conversation about a given topic. And our topic here today is about trying to bend this cost curve, and specifically about how new medicines and how some of the things on the cutting edge pose new types of policy, regulatory, and market challenges because of the pace of science and the pace of medicine. My name is DJ Wilson, one of the chief singers and dancers here at State of Reform, and really excited to tee up this conversation for us today, talking about this RX curve conundrum. It's an issue that we've been dealing with as a society for a couple of decades now, and it's going to take more conversations like this one, not fewer, for us to make it all through. So without further ado, let me jump right into our introductions. We got a great group of folks with us today. First, we've got Robert Popovian, who's a pharmacist, a PharmD. I got to put the credential in there. He's a senior fellow at for Health Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. Sarah Eikenberry is a senior communications advisor for therapeutics, biologics, and biosimilars at the Food and Drug Administration. And Kashyap Patel, MD. Dr. Patel is the president of the Community Oncology Alliance. I appreciate each of you all making time to be with us. Kashyap, why don't we start with you first? Tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you're doing and where you're allocating your attention these days.
Thank you, DJ, and thank you for allowing me to join your kind of team to share my views. I have multiple jobs depending on what time of the day and what day of the week I'm talking about. So few days I'm seeing the patients, the other days I'm in the policy world. I also lead the national group called Community Oncology Alliance as a president, where we got involved with Congress, Senate, and policymakers, both at DC as well as state level, to ensure that, number one, the patient's treatment rights are protected, anything that impacts their outcome, as well as access to care. We work together along with other alliances to ensure that we represent facts in the right way. And also, we also advocate for the measures that allows the small, medium, and large community practices to remain independent, because at the end of the day, it's the community oncologists like me that serve the nation's poor and poorest and weakest. So I have that role as well. Apart from that, I'm also writing. I publish. Recently, I was quoted in the Washington Post, New York Times, CBS News. So multiple hats on given day and time, but I'm an oncologist by trade and treat cancer patients 2.5 days a week.
Great stuff. Well, I appreciate you making time. Sarah, how about you? Tell us about the work you're doing at the FDA.
Hi. So right now at the FDA, it's been pretty busy related to biosimilars. I work on strategic communications and external communications for biosimilar and interchangeable products, and I manage our education and outreach program. So developing education materials for patients and healthcare providers to increase understanding about biosimilar products.
Good stuff. And I appreciate you making time. I know you got a lot going on.
Yeah.
And Robert, tell us about the work that you're doing these days.
Thank you, DJ. Well, I'm a pharmacist, as you mentioned, a PharmD, but I've never practiced. So I'm also a health economist. So I'm, as they say, somebody quoted, a reporter once told me I'm an accountant with a heart. So I do many things besides being a senior health policy fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm also the chief science policy officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation. And I also work with a company called Consensus Health, which is a blockchain technology company. I'm the vice president for health economics and policy there. But primarily what I do is write quite a bit, similar to what Kashyap does. I do a lot of publishing and speaking. I have my own podcast series that we talk about healthcare matters and healthcare policy matters regarding patients. But the most important thing for me and the topic that I care about is really drug pricing, spending, affordability, and access. And it's something I've worked on for the last 2 decades when I was in academia, then after that for the last 20 some odd years at Pfizer. And it's something that's close and near and dear to my heart because I think that we can do better, and we can do better specifically for patients. And there are incentives in the marketplace that make those things very difficult at this point.
Well, I appreciate you making time also, Robert. It's a great panel, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. One of the reasons we host this in this way is that we want to make sure that you in the audience can, of course, participate in any way that is meaningful for you. And for some people, that means sitting and watching. This will be available on demand as well at our site, stateofreform.com. But I'd also encourage you to, use the chat box on the right of the screen here to post any questions that you might have and upvote those throughout the day or throughout our conversation. I'll integrate those questions into our discussion, and we can make sure your voice is part of this. We also want to take the images and these graphics and these slides that we've brought and use these as sort of a flashpoint, a topic that we can, a set of topics that we can use to wrestle this discussion to the ground. And in this first slide, this is one that we've brought. This is one that we've picked up along our travels over the years. I believe this is from a Kaiser Family Foundation slide, and I failed to put the source in there myself, but this is me. This is our slide, and one of the things I think that's interesting about the state of our medicine today is that as we get new medicines into the pipeline, they are as first movers. Often they have a price advantage. And it really takes this sort of follow-on effect to bring competition to the market. And as we get into a world of increasingly personalized medicine, we're going to have this issue over and over and over again. In fact, while rare diseases are extraordinarily rare, meaning they don't impact a lot of people, in totality, rare diseases impact about 1 in 10 folks in the United States. And so there are a lot of things that new medicine has to grapple with, not just vaccinations, which is of course part of it. So in this slide, we see the cost coming down of biologics and the share of biosimilars increasing. I want to ask you first, Robert, what is a biologic? What is a biosimilar? What are we talking about here when we talk about these large molecule medicines compared to aspirin and other medicines from a generation or two ago?
So in a simple way to say, there are two types of medicines: the oral medicines that we take every day, like you mentioned, aspirin, Tylenol, that we walk in and we purchase those medicines either over the counter or in retail pharmacies. And those are synthesized molecules most often, if not almost always now these days. And they're synthesized in the lab in a way that they're identical copies of the originator medicines. In regards to biologics, because they're derived from natural organisms or living cells, it's really the process that matters. So the best way to think about it is that if you go to the Costco, for example, and buy Prego sauce, the Prego sauce is identical versus making the sauce that your grandmother passed on to you over and over again. So you may make some that are different every time. So that's why they're referred to as biosimilars and not identical copies. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not equally efficacious, safe, and in purity are identical. And that's what FDA has said. And in fact, one thing that is not commonly known is that biosimilars actually are scrutinized far more by the FDA because they not only have to go through certain studies similar to generics or pharmacokinetic studies, but they also have to demonstrate equality in efficacy, safety, and purity in clinical trials. So that is the main difference. It's really the synthesized molecule in the lab versus a living cell molecule developed through a different process, and that's why they're referred to as biosimilars. But as I said, FDA has deemed them to be equally efficacious, safe, and in purity to the originator biologic.
So just to underscore that, I think for folks like me who are novices to the topic, a chemical synthesis process that might produce an aspirin pill is a small molecule, relatively straightforward, easy-ish to generate, but one of these larger molecules requires some sort of living entity to process and develop and create the biologic. That's accurate, Robert?
That is absolutely true. For example, one of the best examples I always use is Botox. Botox is botulinum toxin. It's a toxic, that will kill people, but Botox has been synthesized and developed in a process manner that it's a biologic now that's safe to be used as a medical purposes. And that's the difference. So they are from living organisms, absolutely.
So, Sarah, being on the inside of the federal government, how are you? Just give us a sense of how you try to keep track of all of the moving pieces in medicine these days, biologics, biosimilars, and the like. Sometimes government moves more quickly than the market. Sometimes the market moves more quickly than government. Give us a sense of how you're keeping track of where the market is going.
So, I mean, we're definitely monitoring the market as closely as we can. It's not, per se FDA's sort of role to monitor like exactly when companies market products and sort of what the market status is. But overall, I mean, we're obviously keeping pace with the science. The science in the biologic space is moving quickly. Sometimes, like you said, the government might not move as quickly as industry, but we're definitely working at keeping pace. And our primary objectives are to make sure that we approve safe and effective products for patients to use.
And as you, there we go. As you are thinking about your, as the FDA is trying to bring biosimilars on, you want to speak to Robert's statement about how sometimes biosimilars have a slightly different process in terms of regulatory review than biologics?
Well, they have a little bit of a different process than biologics because biosimilars are approved through an abbreviated pathway. And so they don't do the full scale clinical trials like a biologic would do for every indication that's approved. But there are clinical studies involved for most biosimilar approvals. He was also describing like how they compare to generics, and that's a common sort of question that people have. And they're both approved through different, what we call approval pathways. So they have different statutory sort of requirements. And biosimilars, the requirements are more than most generics, which just need bioequivalent studies. They do require a lot more data to approve because of the fact that they are more complicated to produce and make.
So, Kashyap, as you, as a physician, as an oncologist, and as a writer and author, and you're thinking about some of these topics, how would you describe the interplay between where the market is and where the regulatory process is in terms of bringing some of these new medicines to market?
Well, I think, the regulatory agencies have done a phenomenal job of understanding the importance of the incorporation of biosimilars in the arena of treatment. And that's why I think 351K pathway, if I'm not wrong, that's the one that's used for the biosimilars. But to ensure that it's safe, effective, and interchange, or maybe therapeutically kind of equally effective, they undergo rigorous process of structural analysis and PK/PD and all the other studies. And once they come to market as a provider, the way I look at my role, DJ, is, I need to make sure that my patients have access to care. After the COVID-19, we all have understood that there's a severe disparities in the access to care, access to kind of resources. And, one of the examples, about 19% of the Americans do not have who are medical benefits, do not have secondary insurance. That means that the more the expensive the drug is, the more out-of-pocket costs they have to come up with. And there have been studies that shows that incremental rise in the out-of-pocket cost results in patients not taking the drugs. So the FDA's abbreviated pathway, as well as regulatory kind of blessings, has allowed oncologists to adapt biosimilars as soon as they are available in the therapeutic armamentarium.
Good stuff. I want to jump to our next slide. This is one that you've brought to the conversation, Sarah. And there's a lot going on here, so I want to give you a chance to really walk us through it. Take her away.
Okay. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and discuss physician understanding and their willingness to prescribe biosimilars, which also greatly impacts the uptake of biosimilars and, getting patient access to these products. So this slide highlights a recent government-sponsored survey of prescribers that evaluated their understanding and willingness to prescribe. This was an internet-based survey, which took place right before the world shut down in December 2019 and January 2020. There were 507 respondents in 5 specialty areas: dermatology, gastroenterology, nephrology, hematology, oncology, and rheumatology. Most of the respondents were male doctors in private practice with the average age of 51 and an average of 19 years experience. So at the time of the survey, only about half of the respondents had experience prescribing biosimilars, and this differed by specialty. Dermatologists were most unlikely to have prescribed one, and hematologist oncologists were most likely. And even among prescribers with experience, but especially in those without biosimilar experience, over half indicated they were somewhat or not at all certain about basic biosimilar related facts. Notably, notably 44.8% of all respondents and 53.1% of those without biosimilar experience remained somewhat or not at all certain about whether the biosimilar had the same expected clinical performance, even after reading educational material describing biosimilarity. And for biologic naive patients, the majority of respondents chose that they would prescribe the reference product when both the biosimilar and reference product were available on the formulary. And this is consistent, some of this data and information is also consistent with DJ's slide and recent other IQVIA and other data that talks about the proportion of market share being hematology oncology, and then that's occurred much more quickly for those products than the other specialty groups.
Kashyap, when you think about prescriptions and physicians being able to prescribe biosimilars, if this sort of naivety or a lack of awareness about the medicine gets in the way, how does your organization approach just making sure that physicians become aware of some of these medicines that they may not have learned about in medical school because frankly they weren't around back then?
So very interesting question, because I represent those last two specialty, hematology and oncology, which has adopted biosimilars maximal. So we actually, as soon as they started appearing in the market back in 2015 and 16 in the oncology and hematology arena, we actually took the cause of the biosimilars. I personally went to the OMB office, HHS office, supporting the incorporation of biosimilars through the different mechanisms, including working on getting the unique Q codes, which is more like a jargon. But also, if you look into the adoption of biosimilars by class of physicians, it's the community oncology providers who actually have adopted it most. And then that's because of the direct emphasis on education. Now, things are not that easy because for all the government beneficiaries, which are Medicare enrollees, we have no restriction on prescribing biosimilars through buy and bill program. But we still face some challenges from the commercial payer. I mean, I'm sometimes surprised to see that commercial payer or pharmacy benefit manager will make it a must for us to use this reference product first. And I don't know why in the world a benefit manager would recommend drug that's 40% higher than the available, accessible, less expensive, but equally effective options. So in half of the patients that I treat at my clinic, that's not a problem. The other half, sometimes we face challenges. But coming back to your original question, DJ, education awareness is the key to help physicians adopt biosimilars, particularly how it plays a role in improving the access to care.
We may have lost DJ.
I'm sure he'll come back in a minute.
Yeah, I know. Never good to lose the host.
We're on our own.
But thank you for what you're doing, Robert. I think you're doing an incredible job in the space for biosimilars, really.
Thank you. And, to be honest with you, I'll continue to talk about what you brought up, Kashyap, and then support what Sarah's doing. Frankly, remember, I'm an economist, so I'm a little bit more cynical. So there's certain things that are blocking the pathway to adoption of that we get rid of rebate contracting. The reason being is that I think one of the things that you mentioned is that why is it that a pharmacy benefit manager or an insurer prefers a more expensive medicine instead of a lower expensive alternative? And that the reason being is that they make more money, frankly,
Exactly.
by keeping a percentage of rebates and all of the fees that they don't pass on back to the employers or to the federal government, in fact. And that's why. So what happened is that this created an emphasis for me to look into this issue more closely. So we did a study, Wayne Weingarten and I did a modeling study looking at what the cost would be of if we get rid of the rebate contracting issue. And what we found is that there will be minimal impact actually on premiums, as insurers, every time you say something, they're going to say the premiums are going to go up. We did the modeling and it's minimal impact on premiums. But the more important thing is to allude to what you said, Keshav, which is it improves adherence among patients. When they can't afford their medicines, they're going to take their medicines. And when they take their medicines, we're going to have better health outcomes. And not only our study supported that, but I go to something that Optum Healthcare did, which is they got rid of rebates and they passed on all the savings at the point of sale to the patient in their study that they did. And on average, the patients saved $130 per prescription every time they filled the prescription. And not only that, adherence improved by 16%. And so this is their own data. And that supports the whole thing that you get rid of rebates or you pass on all the savings to the patient at the point of sale. And you fix two wrongs, which is one, you create a market incentives that you fix the market disincentive for having lower priced alternatives come into the market, such as biosimilars, because again, they make more money by higher price, higher rebated medicines. And the second thing is that you improve out-of-pocket expenditures for patients, because you alluded to, most of the out-of-pocket is based on this arbitrary gross cost, not the net cost of these drugs.
Yeah.
And patients are more adherent to these therapies and they have better outcomes. And this is not only supported like the work I've done, but the work that they did themselves. And it's sort of like they don't even believe their own data when they show this stuff. So that's why in that slide that is up, hopefully in the thing, I talk about both the study that I did and as well as the Optum study that was done to demonstrate the same thing effect on patients out-of-pocket costs.
I want to just herald each of you as being amazing panelists, since I lost internet connectivity and had to jump off and come back, and that's scrambled our Zoom camera, our cameras and all that stuff. So the fault is entirely mine. Credit goes to you three for holding it together. We did have your slide up, Robert, talking about it was a perfect segue. I want to bring in a question from Adam Boschel, who I think it integrates a little bit with Sarah's slide and then this slide. He says prior auth is a factor listed as a factor influencing willingness to prescribe a biosimilar. Is a prior authorization in place is this a prior authorization in place for the reference product, i.e. they don't want to deal with it, so they prescribe the biosimilar?
It's the opposite. I think it's the opposite, where the prior auth is in place for the reference product and they would have to go through jump through the hoops to get authorization to prescribe the biosimilar product.
Got it. So that's that must show up in your study, particularly with Optum there, Robert? Yeah.
Well, not only my study, but exactly what Keshav said. This is the market incentive that doesn't make sense, right? Why would you put on a prior authorization for somebody to get approval for a biosimilar, first having to fail on a more expensive originator biologic? And it should be the other way around. Generally, it's basically prior authorization that you should try a generic or a less expensive alternative before you try more expensive. So this is where the world doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because it boils down to rebate and rebate contracting, because the higher the prices of these medicines, the larger rebates these pharmacy benefit managers and insurers collect. And because they don't pass 100% of these things, I don't care what they say, they don't pass 100% of the rebates, and they certainly don't pass any of the fees and everything else that they collect as concessions. It creates market incentives that biosimilars are sort of disenfranchised compared to the originators and are not prescribed. And so it's a market incentive that needs to be fixed if we want to have what Sarah's doing, which is incredible work with the FDA approving these medicines, and what Keshav is trying to do, which is getting these lower cost alternatives to their patients and have more affordable drugs to the patients. But these middlemen are getting in the middle of the way of doing that.
And it also doesn't make sense because if a patient has to fail on the biologic, they're also, the biosimilar is the same risk and benefit as the originator biologic. So the biosimilar is not going to work for them either, that they're going to need something different.
Exactly.
So in all, the whole system is just broken.
So let me make an argument on behalf of the middlemen referenced here, who I don't think are on our panel. But some people would, of course, argue, a PBM might argue that, hey, we need to be able to organize all of these drugs and medicines and make sure that it is easy to access them. So when you have a patient who needs them, you know that you can get them, or the plan knows that they can be accessed and available. And our fee for organizing this market so that it's accessible and that there are network purchasing benefits, our fee for that is modest and not out of line with the work. Kashyap, when you hear a PBM or somebody who's trying to make that argument, how do you respond?
It's very surprising to see that the middleman who produces nothing argues that they want to take 15, 20, 30, 40% away. Where in the world would you think that if I'm in the business of saving money to my clients and streamline the process of supply, if I recommend them to spend 40% more and restrict the narrow kind of, access to the care, it does not make any logistical sense. The supply chain is very well established. Patients can get their medicines. The biologics and biosimilars are produced everywhere. It's again going back to Robert's point, is it's the rebate rules that allows them to take the back-end money back into the pocket. The problem is, at the end of the day, DJ, I serve in South Carolina, in rural counties. About a third of my patients barely make $1,400 a month. Maybe half of them out of that third have Medicare only, so they don't have 20% Medigap insurance. So using a filgrastim, which is about $2,000 more expensive, imposes $400 extra out-of-pocket cost on the patient's pocket. Now, put math together. A family, the husband, wife, both Medicare beneficiaries, makes barely $2,000 a month if they have to pay $400 every 3 weeks, in addition to the other drug. For example, you look at the rituximab, look at the bevacizumab, how they're going to afford that. So end of the day, we actually dehumanize treatment of patient by bringing too many middlemen, by putting extra cost on the people who are least privileged. Mahatma Gandhi once said that when you wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror and say, what you do today, is it going to make a difference in the most underserved, marginalized person? If it's something that does it, good. If it does not, don't do that.
Let me ask this question from Randy Ray, who's with us. He says, what can be done from a policy and funding perspective to ensure diverse, equitable representation in the research being done to develop these biologics and biosimilar treatments? Genetic variation among human populations may exacerbate disparities in health as we integrate individual genetic information into care. And he says that research says 84% of the current genome data is of European descent and only 1% is from African descent. So on this question of how to get a more equitable set of genome data so that we can run trials and do research on a population that looks more like the population at large, any of you have thoughts on how to address this diversity challenge?
I can take it because that's very close to my heart. For those of you who read Washington Post and New York Times, Washington Post had about 3 pages covering my practice on October the 12th. Started on the front page above the fold with picture of my patient. I've been working on diversity, exclusivity, and the equity and inclusivity. I am very much familiar with the GWAS data that you just talked about, where even though the Northern European ancestry makes 9.7% of the world population, 80% of the genome data is based on their population. So it's going to skew the development of the drugs. In order to address this, I've started 3 big programs. One is called Prefer Registry, where we are trying to enroll patients of minority origin into the genome database, particularly for those who already have a cancer. There's another one called Prospective Registry. And the third one I'm trying to build up with all the hereditary cancer. You are absolutely spot on that if we do not encourage participation of the minority population in the human genome database, that would enable us to identify difference in how they respond to the drugs, in how we can develop new drugs for them. We will not be providing equitable care. It may be much worse than what is right now in the next 20 years. And the perfect example is state of Hawaii has imposed $417 million fines to 2 big pharma companies with the premise that one of the drugs, which is a blood thinner that they jointly marketed, does not work in Pacific Islanders because it never was tried in them. And the chance of the drug working is 1 versus 7 Caucasians. So there's been a severe disparities, and I would say, structural bias in access to testing, which will lead to the access to the right kind of drug that works in them.
Go ahead,
EJ,
Robert.
let me address this too from a drug development perspective. So especially now that we're going to these gene and cell therapies that we're developing, if we don't, and we're trying to develop these drugs that are off the shelf, right, to be able to use it for multiple patient populations. If we don't do what Keshop said, but to encourage and to sort of get this information into the genomic information of different patient populations, ethnicity, race, everything else into this thing, what we're going to develop is drugs that is pretty much homogeneous for a specific set of patients. And that's going to be key. So it's not only about getting them involved with regards to finding therapies for them, but also developing therapies long-term, especially with the cell and gene therapies that we're trying to do, which are off the shelf. This is going to be key, very important.
So Sarah,
I was going to say just on FDA's sort of behalf that I know that they have many efforts and a focus on increasing diversity in clinical trials, and they've been working for many years to try to help do that. And they have a project that they embarked on several years ago called Drug Trial Snapshots to kind of show who participated in the clinical trial in an easy to read format for the approved drugs. But it shows mostly what we know. It's, white, European or Caucasian, men, mostly men.
Mostly men.
So,
Sure.
yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yep,
So,
exactly.
is there a conversation happening in regulatory circles or any policy circles that you're aware of, Sarah, that might require drug manufacturers to be able to test in a more diverse population than the genome data set would allow, requiring them, therefore, to go build the population data sets that would become a regulatory requirement before they enter the market? Is that a conversation point?
I'm sure that it's being thought about and being researched and looked into. I mean, it's not, that wouldn't just be the FDA, NIH and others would need to be involved. And it's a very complex issue that I'm not really aware of all the specifics that FDA is doing for that.
I think that 21st Century Cures Act version 2 is being debated between, I think, Frank Pallone and CMR. I may be mistaken by the names of the congressmen and congresswoman, but I know that there's a bipartisan effort going on to bring version 2 of Cures Act, which probably may mandate having certain representative population in new drug development. And going back to Robert's point, when we are looking to personalized medicine, where on one hand we are looking into, we'll have a kind of targeted medicine for each person. On the other hand, we don't have enough data to see what the biological homogeneity is. And so it may become very relevant, and I'm sure there will be some congressional effort that will happen in near future with the view to bring some sort of regulatory power to FDA and the NIH to make sure that drugs are tested in appropriate diverse ethnic population.
CMR being, I believe, Kathy McMorris Rogers.
Yeah, I may be wrong. Don't quote me on that, DJ. But I think I know two congressmen from both the sides are trying to work on that.
Yeah, they lead the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, so that's where a lot of it's where a lot of everything originates in U.S. policy. I want to go back to this slide that we had up here a minute ago from you, Robert. This is the slide that where you specifically highlight that the rebate contracting creates the wrong market incentives. You have and I'm going to mess up the acronym, the Epclusa authorized generic, 24,000 versus an Epclusa preferred medicine of 78,000. That there's a 70% delta there. You want to explain what you're talking about there?
Yeah, so what I did is basically, and I pulled this up yesterday because I wanted to update the slide for the Express Scripts national formulary. And it's a PDF file. You guys can Google it. It'll come up. For 2022, if you look at it, they exclude, or they say the non-preferred agent is the authorized generic of Epclusa, which is created by the same pharma company. So there is no if and or buts or any discussion about that these are not identical drugs. And and the brand name is preferred over the authorized generic. And this is where I was going back on the previous one. The market incentives matter. And we have incentives in the marketplace right now that formularies are being designed for the sheer purpose of optimizing rebate capture or increasing rebate, how much rebates that are collected by the pharmacy benefit managers and insurers. And this is one example where a brand name drug, which is about 70% more expensive, is preferred over an authorized generic drug, which is, by the way, both of them are manufactured and created by the same pharmaceutical company. So these incentives do matter. So when we have an incentive in the marketplace that creates a rebate contracting, and DJ, I want to go back to the comment that you made. It's not all about rebates. It's about fees and everything else that they collect. And if you go back to the Pew research from about a couple of years ago, you will see that the Pew research was able to find that rebates actually have stabilized and they're not growing as fast. It's the fees and everything else that are growing faster. And what we need at the end of the day, and I wrote about this on a piece that was published in Morning Consult this morning, is that we need to have audit rights of the ledgers of the PBMs to see how much fees, rebates, discounts, and everything else is collected. And those audit rights should be given to the federal government, which is the number one purchaser of pharmaceuticals in the United States, and every employer should have access to that information. We need to know exactly how much are they being collected. And this is the incentive that we need to guard against, because employers need to say, why are we covering a brand name drug and excluding an authorized generic, which is manufactured by the same manufacturer?
Good stuff. There's a lot in these slides. They'll be available on our site when we post this video. You'll be able to get these slides in a link there in the story. I want to go to this next slide from you, Sarah. It's got a lot of educational information and resources. Why don't you walk us through what you've got on this slide?
Yeah, sure. This is just a sort of a sampling of some of our available educational resources that the FDA has developed for patients and healthcare providers. One of our main goals that we have in our biosimilars action plan is to develop effective communications to improve understanding among patients, clinicians, and payers about biosimilars. And we have a variety of resources that can be found at our web address there. I encourage viewers to, go visit our website, look at the materials, repurpose the materials for your own use. You can take it and, take our logo off if you want and use it as your own. But we found that stakeholder education and outreach plays a large part in this effort, and that our stakeholders are the ones who really can get to that audience that needs to be educated, because patients, they want to hear from their providers, and providers want to hear from their clinical associations. And they might not necessarily think about the FDA as a resource for general education related to biosimilars. So that's the main goal of this slide, is just to highlight those resources.
Yeah, good. Let me ask you, Sarah, to just sort of step back for a second. So much of this conversation is informed by the last 5 or 10 years as biologics and biosimilars have really started to come on the market or onto the market. When we are having this conversation, when we get this band back together in 2031, 10 years from now, what are we going to be talking about in 2031, in 10 years, about the challenge, the regulatory and market challenges related to biologics and biosimilars?
I mean, I really hope we're not talking about the same things. I think that we're going to make a lot of forward progress, but it's really going to take a lot of what Robert and Keshav have been talking about in order to make that a reality. I mean, the reimbursement and cost is the main determining factor in people's use of a biosimilar product. So until some of those things are ironed out, we might be having this conversation again in 10 years.
It seems to me, Robert,
DJ,
the one thing
can I make one comment before I lose the train of thought from Sarah? I think we don't need to wait 10 years. We need to wait until end of 2023. 2023 is a seminal moment for biosimilars. That's when 6 biosimilars are going to be approved in the same year for Humira, which is the largest selling biologic in the United States. It has over $17 billion or $16 billion in sales in the US marketplace. So we're going to have 6 competitors in the market, and we're going to see by end of 2023 how the market's reacting, how the insurers are reacting to this, how our pharmacy benefit managers reacting to this marketplace. And we can basically get back in 2020 and December 30th of 2023 and figure out what happened, because it's going to be very simple. My hope is that the market will fix itself, and in fact that lower cost alternatives will be favored over higher priced biologics.
So those 6 adalimumab biosimilar products are already approved, and one of them is approved as interchangeable, but they are prevented from entering competition due to patent agreements and other things with reference product manufacturer. I think one of our other hopes is that we'll really see some great forward momentum with the insulin products and the interchangeable insulin that is hopefully soon to be on the market, because that is given at the pharmacy and can hopefully help the millions of Americans who have diabetes.
Well, at a minimum, I would think that we will see a lot more biologics enter the market, right? Just this is sort of the tip of the spear. I assume that we will just have an increasing range of biologics over the coming years, which will put further pricing pressure on the market to try to figure out how to manage all of this. Is that an accurate assessment?
So you're going to have two things. You're going to have more biologic brand names coming into the market. That creates market incentives to lower prices. But unfortunately, if we don't get rid of rebate contracting, we're not going to see that. We're going to see prices just keep increasing, the gross prices, but not know what the net prices happens. The second thing is with biosimilars coming to the market, you're absolutely right. There's going to be more market competition coming into the market from a biosimilar space, but not only in these spaces that we're talking currently, which is autoimmune disorders, oncology, supportive cancer care therapies, but or insulin, we're going to see things like for MS drugs. There's a whole slew of MS drugs that are being investigated to looked upon is going to be the next iteration. So I'm hoping that we will mimic what the European market looks like, which is you're going to have multiple classes of medicines with multiple biosimilars available in those classes, and there will be a suppression of those prices. And what we will see is that we will have better access to these medicines for the patients, and there will be earlier therapy or broader therapy with these agents moving forward.
Let me ask this question from Jeff Baldetti, who asks, how should the market think about interchangeable insulin biosimilars, insulin authorized generics, and now authorized interchangeable insulin biosimilars? Are the authorized generics now considered interchangeable as well? Anyone want to take that word salad and take it apart?
I can take a crack at it. First, let me explain to you what interchangeability in the biosimilar market means. It's a regulatory designation. It has nothing to do with the safety and efficacy and purity of these medicines. That's one thing that has been a misinformation that has been bandied about in the marketplace, that just because a drug doesn't have that interchangeability designation is not equally safe, effective, or pure. Let's put that aside. The only reason we have interchangeable biosimilar designation is because of what can happen at the pharmacy counter with the pharmacist. If the biosimilar has an interchangeability designation, just like Sarah mentioned, there's a Humira that has been approved already, a biosimilar for Humira that's been approved for as a interchangeable biosimilar, as well as we have an insulin one that has been approved as interchangeable. What the pharmacist can do is therapeutically substitute the brand name biologic with a biosimilar without having to get the authority of the physician who prescribed it ahead of time. Now, if the drug doesn't have an interchangeability designation, doesn't mean that the pharmacist can't still substitute. What they have to do is get the authority from the physician who prescribed it to substitute that medicine. In both cases, the pharmacist is still responsible for telling the patient that they did the substitution, just like they have to do with generic medicines, by the way. So in all cases, designation of interchangeability is just a regulatory designation that gives the authority for the pharmacist to substitute a medicine, a biologic with a biosimilar, without having to get the authority of the physician ahead of time. They still have to tell the physician post and everything else, but that's the only thing it is. It has nothing to do with safety, efficacy, or purity of these medicines.
So there's a lot there. Thank you for digging in on that, Robert. I want to ask each of you this last question and we'll wrap up our conversation. I appreciate you sticking with us, technology, kerfuffles, and all. Sarah, first to you. As you look at this topic and healthcare reform in general, what gives you hope these days as we near the end of 2021 that the work we're all doing will improve things? What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Well, besides my children and animals, it really is this sort of goal of increasing access to patients. I mean, just like Keshap is talking about, I mean, there's so many people who need this medication. These are life-changing, life-saving medicines that a significant portion of our population may not have access to. And increasing awareness that they're safe and effective and trying to get these medicines to those who need it is really what also gets me out of bed in the morning.
Keshap, what gives you hope and gets you out of bed in the morning when you think about this topic?
I think we go back to the personalized medicine. The way I'm looking at our science evolution in oncology space, as well as the specialties, is that we are moving away from site of the disease like lung cancer to more biology specific. So I'll be treating more like an ALK positive cancer with some pills instead of worrying about chemotherapy, which is more like a cluster bomb. And also, I think in 10 years from now, we may stop doing scans and with the what we call the liquid biopsy, the blood-based test, instead of putting person through the massive mega scan machines, we may come to a stage where a blood test will tell us if we have cancer or not. And it also will tell us if we have cancer as to what kind of treatment is going to work best. And also it will tell us, is the treatment working or not? So I think I'm very optimistic that we are shifting away from the site of disease to the biology of disease.
Robert, last word. What gives you hope as you look out on the future of the subject in health reform?
I think people like Keshap who are taking care of patients, people like Sarah who are basically helping out, getting out medicines that are very important to the patients. It's all about the patients, and what we need to do is put the patient at the center. And what gives me hope is that we're also having an honest discussion about healthcare policy and not anymore just taking the word of certain parties as being gospel, and we're challenging them and hopefully challenging them with data or lack of data. So those are the things that gives me hope, is both the healthcare professionals, patients, the regulatory folks that are doing the great job to get medicines to the patient.
Robert Popovian, PharmD, Senior Health Policy Fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. Sarah Eikenberry, Senior Communications Advisor for Therapeutic Biologics and Biosimilars at the Food and Drug Administration. And Keshap Patel, MD, the President of the Community Oncology Alliance. Thank you all for making time. And for our attendees in the room here, I appreciate you joining us. We'll have this video up on our site at State of Reform, as well as the slides, so you can download them there. Appreciate you making time. We'll do this again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.